This is an oral history recording with Mary T. Clark. The interviewer is Carmen Visconti, who is a friend since age 5. Today is Thursday, October 25th, 2018. The interview is being recorded at the DeLand House Museum. Mary T., tell us your full name and its origin.
My name is Mary Therese Clark. I was named after my father's mother, who was Maria Teresa Carrata, and she came from Italy. And my nickname is T. I'm also called Mary T, as you called me. I never go by Mary.
Good to know. And you talked about your house growing up here in DeLand.
I grew up at 624 North Florida Avenue, in between University and Pennsylvania, in a little Cape Cod house. It was the first FHA house. My parents received an FHA mortgage in the 1930s. It was a beautiful, beautiful house. I thought it was large when I was a little girl, but it was a teeny tiny house. I'm guessing it was probably 1,000 square feet. We had 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, which was customary at that time. We had a living room, no foyer. You walked directly into the living room. And then there was a floor furnace. And then to the right was a small dining room and a small kitchen.
And tell me about the bedrooms, did you say?
Yes, my parents' bedroom was a typical bedroom. They had 2 single beds. They were tall with the chenille bedspreads, and I would climb up on those, and I loved to because they were so high. My bedroom was just a tiny room with a single bed in it.
And tell us about your neighborhood.
I had the most wonderful neighborhood in the world. We had all kinds of people. We had our friends, the Furlongs, who lived at 201 West Pennsylvania, Janie, my best friend, her older brother Eddie, and then Joe, Bill, and Beth. Then there was an empty lot between the Furlongs' house and our house. And a little later, when we were probably 5 years old or so, the Burries moved in. Chuck, who was 3 years older than, Chuck, who was a year younger than I am, and Leonard, who was 3 years older than I am. And we had across the street, eventually the Baptist parsonage was built. And the first people in that were the Sturtzes, and they had children. In our neighborhood, we played every game you can imagine. We played Mother May I. Our big game was Cops and Robbers. We played jacks. We had marbles. We played hopscotch. We jumped rope. We did all the wonderful kinds of games that children in the 50s did to enjoy themselves.
And you mentioned the parents. What did you call the parents of your friends?
Well, the Furlongs were Aunt Peach and Uncle Ed. In the South in those days, you didn't call an adult by his or her first name unless that adult was adamant that you do so. So, for example, my father's business partner, who were Robbie and Ethel Roberson, I called them Uncle Robbie and Aunt Ethel. And the majority of adults were Aunt and Uncle, occasionally a Miss so-and-so or a Mr. so-and-so, but very few were called by their first names.
You mentioned your father's business partner. What kind of business did your father have?
My father had a store in downtown DeLand at 120 South Boulevard, which was called Roberson Clark Furniture. His partner was, as I said, F.P. Robbie Roberson, and they lived up on West Pennsylvania Avenue. And my father went into the furniture business in Daytona Beach, working for Mather, which was a chain of furniture stores. And he carried furniture. He had to drop out of high school when he was 15. and he began carrying the furniture. And he did that, and eventually he and my mother in the 1930s moved to DeLand. Mr. Roberson, Uncle Robbie, had the money. My father had the expertise, so they became partners. Eventually, in the 1960s, Uncle Robbie retired, and my father purchased a store from him. The store was a large 3-story building, still there. It had the bottom floor was just a narrow room, and then there were 2 other stores next to it originally, and that is how it is now. When my father purchased it, he knocked the walls through and made it into one large first floor. We already had the second floor and the third floor. It was full of furniture.
Tell us more about the DeLand area and the stores and what you remember about the stores.
Well, I remember a lot about the stores because we had the store downtown. I was downtown a lot, and Janie and I would come downtown, or I'd go by myself. And I was an only child, so I learned to entertain myself early on. I would walk downtown on the west side of the boulevard, which most people now call Woodland Boulevard, but we called the boulevard. Even the yardsticks and the pencils for my father's store say 120 South Boulevard up until the late 1960s when it started Woodland Boulevard. And I'd walk down, and on Church Street, on the right-hand side was a place called Kemp's, K-E-M-P, Kemp's Donut Shop. And in there they had a small counter with frosted root beer mugs. And in the corner they had a big round, it looked like a big round open tin thing that was deep to me. And inside of it, there was lots of oil, and you could see the glazed donuts just popping and going around in a circle in there. That was a very popular place. Across the street from that was the First Baptist Church, which was a beautiful big brick church. And I went to kindergarten in their administration building, which is a white building that was behind. Of course, those are unfortunately no longer there, but that's how Church Street got its name, because of the First Baptist Church. But I'm kind of going to go down the west side of the street because that's where I would walk, although over on the left were Woolworths and Pennies and fountains, which were important. But as you walked down the street, eventually you came to Ballou's Shoes, and that was a children's shoe store, along with a family shoe store, which was also there. But Ballou's Shoes had a place where you could go in and step up and put your feet and have your feet x-rayed, and you could look at the bones in your feet. Now we think how dangerous that was, but we didn't know that in those days. And Mr. Ballou also had a very tiny merry-go-round with 3 little horses that went around. I was actually a little old to be on those horses, but I always wanted to go on them. Then down the street a little bit, we had Steinemeyer's Grocery. That's where everybody went grocery shopping. You'd park out front and go in, and in the back, Fred Gress had a meat market that sat at the back. They had 2 of the tall, old-fashioned glassed-in counters where the meat was in there, and in the middle, they had a small wooden area where you paid and where you talked to the person through that. And I'd go in when Mother was doing grocery shopping. I'd go in and talk to Mr. Gress in the back, and then to Uncle Truett, that was his store that eventually became Steinemeyer's Thriftway, which was out on West New York Avenue. And as you go on down, you hit DeLand Sundries, which was at the corner of Rich and the Boulevard. And they had a counter where you could go in and have sodas and ice cream and everything. And this was a little before my time, that I know the high school students from the high school went down there a lot, which makes me kind of divert off to Clara Avenue at where the old high school was. And across the street on Clara, on the northeast side of the road, there is still an empty lot there, and it's at an angle. And there was a little store there. I have a very vague memory of it, but I do know that the high school students went there to get things to eat. Then back to the boulevard, we go on down, and we had Linden's Vogue, which was a women's clothing store. We had Touchton's Pharmacy, which was on the corner of New York and the boulevard. It did burn. They had a fire there, maybe, I don't remember exactly how old I was, probably 10 years old. I do know that I believe 2 men were killed in that fire. That's, again, I was young enough to remember it, but not to remember specifics. And that, obviously, it probably gutted the store, but the building is still there and in use. And then as we go on down the street, and I'm sure I've missed some places, but as we go down the street, we have Western Auto on the right-hand side of the street. And then my father's store, which is on the corner of Georgia Avenue, which he called Short Street. A lot of people called it Short Street because it ended at Florida and went from the boulevard to Florida.
Very interesting. You mentioned a couple of things. One, 2 other stores, Woolworths and McCrory's, and your allowance. Could you weave that into a story for us?
Well, I think I started receiving an allowance when I was 6 or 7 years old, and it was a quarter. And I was allowed to do whatever I wanted to with that. And later on, when I was about 11, I was given a 50-cent allowance. Now, the 50-cent allowance, my father would give me 2 extra pennies, and I would walk down to Woolworths, which was on the northwest side of the boulevard in New York, and go to the counter there, and for 52 cents, I could get a hot dog, a cherry smash, and French fries. And that would eat up my allowance.
And what was a cherry smash?
Cherry smash, I think, was just seltzer water, just sparkling water with a little bit of cherry juice in it. But I thought it was great. Janie, my best friend, she always got a cherry Coke instead.
You mentioned some storefront windows, and one in particular had maybe some cowboy outfits in it.
Well, you're talking about McCrory's, which was across the street. Now, McCrory's was there before Woolworths. And my memories of both of those stores include the wooden floors and the smells. I loved to go into those stores and the smells. And McCrory's had little glass-covered counters that had things in them that you could go in and look. However, in the window, one day I walked downtown and there was the most beautiful window full of Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett everything. Davy Crockett guns, vests, coonskin caps, and I wanted a coonskin cap very, very much. Well, I longed for it. I looked at it, but of course I didn't save my money. I was using it for other things. So I never did get that, but memory of that cap is really strong. As is on that side of the street, looking back up in the next block where Fountain's Men's Store was, going into Mr. Herbert Jackson, who worked in there, and his wife worked for my parents. And also on the other side, Mr. Olin Martin, who handled the shoes. And I would walk, when I was on that side of the street, I would always walk in and talk with Mr. Martin and Mr. Jackson. And then go on to McCrory's, and then across the street to Penny's, to the Drika building. And my main memory of Penny's is they had a very wide staircase, as my parents' store did. So I guess most of the old stores had extremely wide staircases. And you would go down to the basement, and that's where they kept the fabric. I loved the smell of the fabric. and I would walk around in there, and everybody knew everybody in DeLand, so nobody ever said anything. And I can remember I would walk up, it was mostly cotton, and I would sniff the fabric, which also reminds me when I would go to Mary Dykes, which was on the other side of the road, the children's store. I had a lot of make-believe. I had make-believe friends. I had pretend friends. But I also had a very vivid imagination. And I would take all of my imaginary children with me into Mary Dykes. And when I was in there, I knew their names and their ages. And every time I went in, then the children would change. But I'd say like, okay, little Eddie, this is a wonderful suit for you. And I would hold it up and look, it would fit little Eddie. And I'd say, well, your little twin sister, Elaine, is here. Let's go find one that matches, that goes for her. And because they knew me, nobody ever said a word in those stores. And I would just walk around for, it seems like forever, playing those games.
Well, you mentioned imaginary friends. Did you also have other imaginary friends? I'm thinking of your father and a tradition he had each evening.
Yes, I had 3 pretend friends. The first one's name was Tenley Audrey. The other 2 were Ouija and Gigi. Tenley Audrey took precedence. I believe I never really thought of her when I was a child as being myself, but she did have curly dark hair and dark eyes. So I guess she was kind of like an alter ego, so to speak. But my father, George Clark, who was extremely creative. Now, he was a businessman. He was the ultimate salesman selling furniture. But he had a creative streak you wouldn't believe. And almost every night for the first 10 years of my life, he told me a story about Tenley Audrey and Ouija and Gigi. And they lived near the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River was always overflowing its banks and having a storm. And in the story, things would come floating down the river. There might be a big sofa floating down the river. There could be a bicycle upside down floating down the river. And one of the most vivid stories I remember is a tire floating down the river, an automobile tire. And they would fish. They would have their little poles, and on their poles, all they had on their poles were pins, little safety pins that were opened, and they'd have them out. And his story would be like this. He'd say, and Gigi threw out that line, and he caught the edge of that tire, and he pulled, and he wasn't strong enough to get it. So they went to get Ouija, who came up, and little Tenley Audrey, who wasn't supposed to be doing this, would climb out of the little red wagon, and she would go up. And the 3 of them, they'd be tugging on each other's waists. And you have to understand this story would go on and on and on. And eventually, they would drag in that tire. And as it got close, they figured out why it was so heavy, because it was full of mud. And as it got closer, they heard a little sound, and the sound went, meow, meow. And as they got closer, they saw 2 little ears poking up out of the mud. So they pulled and they pulled and they pulled it in, and guess what they found? The most beautiful little kitten you can ever saw, just chock full of mud. So Gigi grabbed that kitten. They put Tenley Audrey back in the wagon, and he would go all through every little step. And they'd start pulling and pulling up the hill, because they lived way up at the top of a hill, and took it in, and their mother let them keep the little kitten. Well, my father found everything in that river. There were diamond rings. There were old shoes worn in the 1800s. There was everything you can imagine, and his imagination was tremendous. I believe that you are born with an innate creativity. However, I also believe, like anything else, that it is nurtured. And I believe my father, without knowing, not consciously knowing what he was doing, he was always stirring that within me. And that's why I ended up doing a lot of artwork. I ended up playing the piano. I ended up doing all kinds of things because of my father's ability to do that. He would put me in the Jeep and we would go out into the woods, up and down the back roads. And we'd go out and we would go fishing. And he was a hunter. He hunted quail. And as soon as I got big enough to sit in the seat of the Jeep and put my foot on the pedals, he would walk, because in Florida, in the scrub, you walk when you're hunting, and the dogs would be out walking. And he would go like this with his hand, and I'd push one foot in, and then I'd push the other foot in and stop the Jeep and just sit there because the dogs were on point. And so that's what I got to do with the hunting. But he took me everywhere. And I'm very, very, I remember it so much, with such wonderful, wonderful memories with both of my parents. But my father was the truly creative one.
You also mentioned spending a lot of time at the store when you were little and your fondness for dolls and art. Could you tell us how that came to be?
Well, I loved dolls from the time I can remember holding my first doll. My first doll came from Mrs. Dozier Clardy, who lived on Clara Avenue. And she made him. It was a sock doll named Skeezix, and I still have Skeezix. And I loved dolls forever. I think it was because I loved children. I loved the faces of the dolls. They all became people to me. I played dolls. I took them down to the store a lot. Up on the second floor is where most of the sofas were. And so I would go up there and just line the dolls up on the sofas. It was wonderful because I could move from sofa to sofa and change vignettes. So I could be in the Victorian era if I wanted to. I could be in a more modern era and move the dolls around. As for the art, ever since I could pick up a pencil, I was drawing. And I drew people. I drew mostly children, very active children. All my children were always running and jumping rope and doing flips and everything you can imagine. Little stick children is what I started with. And we had at the store what would now be termed an old-fashioned towel rack, where you pulled the paper towels down. There were trifold towels. And I would open those up and draw, because it gave me 3 places to make different stories. And I would draw on those towels. We also had a tablet. It was a red tablet, and he gave them out to people at the store. It was I think an Indian something tablet, and it was lined inside, and I would draw on that all the time. So I was busy girl when I was down there, and I loved being down there.
So how did your love of drawing, the stories your father told you, end up into your classroom?
Well, I'll start with the one quick fact that I decided in first grade to become a first grade teacher. And in my classroom, of course, we have regular chalkboards in those days. And I'm a very visual learner. I'm not an auditory learner at all. And I drew a lot on the chalkboards. I illustrated things. I got the children to draw. I felt that was very, very important to do that, because for me, teaching school is an auditory process. Yes, you bring in tactile, you bring in visual things, but let's face it, you have to listen and you have to learn that way. If you don't have a strength in that modality, then you need to bring in the other modalities. So I did a lot of tactile learning in my classroom and a lot of visual learning, knowing that I was going, as you can hear, I like to talk, so I would definitely supplement the auditory with that.
You mentioned writing books when you were a teacher and using some of these maybe imaginary friends that your father introduced you to or you introduced him to.
Yes, I ended up writing books, not publishable books, but little take-home books that I would draw with pen and ink. And then I would take the vocabulary from whatever series we had at that time and supplement it with phonetic material, with phonics, words that can be sounded out. At one time in our school system, we did get away from phonics, which horrified me. In fact, I had a license plate that said, I am for 3 R's. So, because I was so upset that they did that. And that's the way education works. There's a pendulum and it always goes like this and it never stops right in the middle. So I would take these little take-home books and give them to the teachers. Now, that's predominantly when I was in administration that I was doing that, although I did it before. And I used my art. I made signs for the teachers for their doors, and they would have children on them. And it might say, Ms. Visconti for you, and it might have pictures of children sitting all over the letters and that type of thing. So yeah, I definitely use my art.
You went into teaching. Who influenced you the most?
Well, as I said, when I was in kindergarten at the First Baptist Church, then for first grade, I specifically remember my mother taking me over to Wisconsin Avenue School, and I remember there was a tall counter that I couldn't see over, and she was registering me for school. Now, they had petitioned to try and get a school going at St. Peter's, which was a Catholic church in DeLand. It didn't look like it was going to come to fruition at that time, maybe later, but not at that time. So I was registered to go to Wisconsin Avenue. However, the priest, Father William Newhouse, went up to Monroe, Michigan, to the Mother House of the Immaculate Heart of Mary's Sisters. And he was able to talk to the Mother Superior, and she sent down 2 nuns, Sister Mary Samuel and Sister Marie Leon. And they opened on time for us, for you, Carmen, and for me, to be first graders at St. Peter's School. We started in the hall, and we have pictures of us sitting in the hall. I had a little A-frame chalkboard, and I had a little record player, and that's what we started with. Mother brought those in. And eventually we moved to a big old house that sat on the corner of Delaware and Rich. It's now gone, and it's where the parking lot is to the back of St. Peter's. However, the steps are still there going up from Rich Avenue. Now, our first grade teacher was Sister Mary Samuel. Had such a profound impact on my life. The way she was always smiling, she was always happy, and she made learning so much fun. I even remember the first song that we sang. I remember everything about her. And in first grade, I knew that's what I was going to do. And we had 2 grades together, first and second grade, all the way through, 2 grades. So in second grade, I really remember the new first graders coming in. And another one of our classmates, Cindy Van Hook. And Sister Mary Samuel was walking outside holding Cindy's hand. And I'm walking behind. And I'm just walking behind, like, what is she holding that girl's hand for? She's supposed to be holding my hand. And I remember her saying to me that she loved me, but she also loved Cindy. And that this was Cindy's time right now. And it didn't mean she loved me any less. And that stayed with me. And from then on, I was going to be a first grade teacher. The only time I waffled at all was when I was a freshman in college. And I thought about going in to be a graphic artist. And I went to see Fred Messersmith, who was head of the art department at Stetson, and I knew him, and I took in some of my artwork. And he looked at it, and he told me, yes, you do have talent. And he says, a graphic artist? And I said, yes, because I like to draw. I wasn't doing landscapes and paintings and everything. And he said, well, let me just ask you a question. He said, how would you feel about going into a room with 100 other people who are equally as talented, who have also received their degrees in art, and taking your portfolio in and selling yourself, showing why you were the best? And I said, no. That I knew that was not part of who I was. And he just kind of smiled at me, and he didn't say anything else. But when I left, I knew that my dream of being a first grade teacher is what I would do, and that I would use my art through the years for that.
You mentioned Sister Mary Samuel, and I was wondering about other friends you had there at that school, how long you went to that school. And also I'm thinking of a neighbor around the corner that went to that school with you.
Okay, well, the neighbor around the corner who lived on University Avenue was Connie Fair. She lived there with her parents, her older brother Johnny, and eventually her little brother Tony. And Connie and I would walk to school after, well, first of all, we were taken in cars. Mother would drive us. Mother, who had worked for Daddy all the time, decided she was now my mother at home most of the time. So she would drive us to school. Then we started walking to school, and eventually we rode our bikes to school. And we had so many good friends at school. You, as my interviewer, Carmen Visconti, Patricia Mattingly, Patty Taylor, Patsy David, Patty Pettengill, oh my goodness, Jackie Earle, so many, 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 Elizabeth Bailey. I'm thinking of boys, Steve Baldoff, and Ronnie Wiedekind, and Tom Clausen, and Frank Jamara, and Bruce Mansour. And I know I'm forgetting a lot, but they're all wonderful, wonderful people. And we went through 8th grade together and went over to public school as freshmen in our 9th grade year.
You mentioned once before about Santa Claus and finding out about...
Yes. Well, we went to school with the Baldoffs, and there were the Baldoff twins, Jean and Joan, who were a year ahead of us. And when we were still walking before we started riding our bikes, we would walk home, and they lived down on Sans Souci Avenue. And we were sitting at the corner, and Connie and I were going to proceed on our way home. And one of the twins said there was no Santa Claus. That was quite a shock. So, of course, we went running home in 1st grade. And I went to my mother, and I don't remember exactly what she said, but I wasn't sure. However, on Christmas Eve, I was lying in bed, and I heard this thump, 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 thump on the wall. It sounded like it was on the ceiling because my room opened up to the fireplace. My father, I found out many years later, got up on a chair and he went across the wall like he was reindeer. And therefore, I still kind of believed in Santa Claus for quite some time. But I'd like to mention my mother because I haven't said much about my mother. And I just wanted to mention that I was the most privileged person in the world to have the parents that I have.
She was definitely an influence on your life. Tell me about your polio vaccine.
Well, Dr. Salk came out with the first vaccine, which was a shot, and then the Sabin vaccine, which was an oral vaccine. But we all had to have shots, and I was petrified of shots to the point of practically passing out. And we went to Dr. Theodore Hahn's office. He was the doctor who facilitated my adoption. And I was in the back seat, and I got a hold of the hump in the back, on the floor in the back seat, holding on. And I still remember my mother, the nurse, and Uncle Ted, that was the doctor, pulling me by my feet to get that shot and any other shots I had to have. Well, many years later, I am getting ready to move to Taipei, Taiwan in my mid-20s. And a medic is giving my son and me shots. So I have my son on my hip, and his arms are about that big around. And I'm looking like this, and the medic kept looking at me. And I said, just be careful, his arms are so thin. And he finally said, what do you mean his arms are so thin? I said, I don't want the needle to come out the other side. Here I am, 25 years old. And he went hysterical, laughing. And he said, what do you think happens? I said, well, of course. You push that plunger, and in goes the needle. So he promptly explained to me about giving inoculations. And what that resulted in is every year after that, I had taught school before that, but every year after that, I would work around into that subject with children, and you'd be very surprised. Probably half of the children think that that's what happens when you have a shot. And so I would explain to them what happened, not to worry. And I thought, how did I get through that whole part of my life screaming and yelling about shots? But no one ever thought, I guess no one I was around ever thought of that, and to say that to me. So I tell children, even now when I see children and I get to know them, I'll talk and say, now, have you had a shot for that? Do you like shots? No. Are you afraid of shots? Uh-huh. And I said, why? Well, because of that needle. And I'm going, okay, this is what happens. It's only a little bitty needle.
And it only goes so far. It doesn't go through your
so
arm.
Far. That's right.
You talked about a favorite book, too. Tell me about that book and how you got it.
Well, one of my very favorite books was called Prudie. It was actually written, I was looking at it the other day, and it was actually written in 1863. Mr. and Mrs. Marshall lived across the street from us on North Florida. She ended up being my 9th grade English teacher. But one day when I was a little girl, there sitting on her trash pile was a little book. And so I took it. It was on the trash, and I read it, and it was all about this little girl named Prudie. And Prudie got into what they called a hog's head. Well, hog's head evidently is something that they put cheese in to make cheese. Well, I didn't know that. It just said a hog's head. So for years, I thought that there was this hog's head that somehow you lifted up the head of the hog and she got in there to hide. But anyway, I have that book. I lost the original. My dear son, Clark, went online and found it again and got it for me.
Lovely. You also mentioned Clark and the shot, and also being adopted. Do you want to tell us more about that?
Well, I was born in Mount Dora, Florida, July 20th, 1946, at an unwed mother's home, which was located over the Mount Dora General Hospital on 4th Street, just off Donnelly. It was run by a doctor and his wife, who was a registered nurse, Mr. and Mrs. Richardson. And the girls, who were mostly from up north or from farther away in Florida or up north, were sent down, and they lived upstairs. And I did find out years later when I went over that they would take the girls out at night to walk. Because you have to understand that in those days, that was a disgrace. It was a horrible thing to be unwed and have a baby. And I was adopted by Blanche and George. Blanche Galbraith Clark, I need to mention her maiden name, and George Clark from DeLand, and brought home when I was 10 days old.
Did you ever visit Mount Dora Hospital, or the hospital where you were born?
When I was 17, I decided I would ride over there. By that time, I had already hit the teenage angst. And so I decided that I would ride over. Of course, I didn't tell my mother. And when I got over there, the hospital had been closed. But Mrs. Richardson still owned it, the building. She was sitting on a front porch. And I didn't know who she was, of course. But I got out of the car and I went up and I just said hello. And she says, "You're one of my babies. Come back to visit." And in my mind at that time, I thought, well, of course she would say that. You know, somebody my age, what else would she say? And then she said, "You look just like your mother, only she had blonde hair and blue eyes." Well, I knew from the non-identifying information that I had, that my parents had, that she had green eyes actually, but light eyes and light hair. And so I knew that I had to look a lot like her for her to say that. She told me that she played the piano and entertained the girls. We also knew from the non-identifying information that she was a very accomplished pianist. I asked her to tell me anything about her, which she wouldn't. In those days, that was just something that they didn't do. They had promised the girls not to. However, I did know from the non-identifying information that she was 25 years old when she had me and that she was a registered nurse. That I did know.
Did you eventually find her?
Well, I put in DNA in the early 2000s to Family Tree DNA and then to Ancestry. Nothing happened. Fourth or fifth cousins would pop up here and there. And then one day, up popped a message that said, "You have either a nephew, an uncle, or a first cousin." So I was in shock. So I got, and this is from Family Tree DNA. So I got the 800 number and called immediately and said, "What does this mean?" I mean, I was so nervous that might have told me that, but I didn't understand it. And he explained it to me and said yes. And they contacted the other side, who then contacted me. Turned out that I had two first cousins. One's 2 years older, one's 4 years older. The family's from Kingsport, Tennessee. And they said, they thought, first of all, that I was the person who would have been my uncle's child. We've quickly figured out that wasn't it. Then when I told them about the piano playing and the registered nurse, and they said, oh, definitely they knew who it was. It was their Aunt Nell. But the first thing was, Aunt Nell never had any children. Oh, yes, Aunt Nell did have a child. Unfortunately, Aunt Nell died very early when she was 52 years old. So I was never able to meet her. But Clark and I and his wife, Vicki, flew up, to Martinsburg, West Virginia, where one cousin lived, and another one was in Pennsylvania. And he came down and I met both of them. Then I went over to Kingsport, met a double second cousin who's a genealogist who gave me the whole family history, so I have it all the way back. And I just want to add in, I'm thrilled to have them as family. However, my family is my adoptive family. And they're like an extra bonus over here on the side. But my mother, my father, my son, my aunts, my uncles, those are my family.
Did it turn out that you actually did look like your biological mother?
Oh, very much so. My son, even more so. Clark was a redhead with blue eyes. And he had that, I have olive skin. He had fair skin. And that was coming from that side of the family. And there's definitely, with the two of us, a family resemblance, yes.
You talked about your mother before. How about the Girl Scouts and maybe Children's Museum?
Well, Mother was very active in everything. She was what I call the ideal mother. And my father, the same. Very different individuals, both very business-oriented. She was a bookkeeper for my father. And yet they both, Father definitely had the very creative side. Mother was also very creative. They furnished and they did the interior design for many homes in DeLand because they both had that natural talent. But Mother wanted me to be a Girl Scout. The Girl Scouts had gone out of vogue. For whatever reason, they weren't active in Volusia County, or very active. And so she went to Stetson and she recruited Stetson girls to start a couple of troops up. Now, at that time, I was still too young to be a Brownie because we started Brownies in those days in 2nd grade, and I was in 1st grade. And then she got the momentum going. She was one of these people, take charge. Whatever she did, she accomplished with finesse. No doubt about it, throughout her whole life. And she started that. She eventually became our Girl Scout leader, Carmen. She eventually became the president of the Volusia County Girl Scouts. And we had a wonderful time. I went to Deer Lake Girl Scout Camp up in the Ocala National Forest from the time I was 8 through 14. I loved it. Probably some of my happiest memories are being there, and my parents always made sure that I could go off to camp.
Wonderful. Now, do you remember the Children's Museum?
Oh, yes, I remember the Children's Museum. 2 things I remember. I remember the library where we had story hour in a little tiny building. It had a name, and I don't remember it. It was a little tiny screened-in building behind the library where you could go and sit on little wooden benches for story hour. And the Children's Museum where we did all kinds of art things. I made a little blue dog. I painted him blue out of clay. I made a bowl. We did little etchings with some type of copper where we etched on things. The Children's Museum took us in buses out to DeLand Springs, where most of us learned to swim. It was a wonderful, wonderful time to grow up in DeLand.
Do you have any memories of high school and what happened there?
Well, sure. After I graduated from St. Peter's in 8th grade, I went across the street to DeLand Junior High School. And at that point in my life, I was pretty shy. Believe it or not, I did go through a short period of time where I was shy. And I was changing environments from being at St. Peter's going into a much larger school. And we had a lot of fun. I remember going with Connie to dances, and we would walk to the old lunchroom there, and we would go to the dances, and Connie, she was very gregarious, and she would dance, and I'd stand against the wall. But I wasn't unhappy. It was just that I was in an environment I didn't understand at that time. Then we went into our sophomore year, where we were both in the junior high building, which exists now as part of the administrative building, and the old high school, which unfortunately burned. But we were there until January of our sophomore year, when the new high school out on Hill Avenue was built. By that time, I was starting to come out of my short-lived shy shell. And I had a wonderful time in high school. I was wearing glasses. I am very nearsighted. And our eye doctor, Dr. Clower in Daytona, told my parents to take me up to Jacksonville to get contacts, because contacts were not common in those days. And my eyes were so rapidly going bad that even though this isn't accurate, at that time they thought that putting a hard lens on the eye would stop the change in the eyeball. So my father took me up. I don't remember the name of the doctor. I didn't want the contacts. In fact, when I was having them put in, they said I'd never wear them because my eyelids flip back inside out as I'm like this, as this man is trying to put these in. So we go up maybe 2 or 3 times. The whole time I'm tearing because of the contacts. About the 4th or 5th trip to Jacksonville, my father had a good sense of humor. He said, "Mary T, you're either going to wear them or I'm going to put them where the sun don't shine." And I'm like, oh dear. So I finally put them in myself. And I went to look in the mirror. Well, that was my first time ever really seeing myself without glasses. And I went, wait a minute. I kind of liked what I saw. And I thought, okay, that's it. I'm going to wear the contacts. And I've been wearing contacts now for 57 years.
And that changed a whole lot of your social life?
It changed my attitude toward myself. It made me more confident. I realize now I was fine with the glasses. In fact, I had my first date when I was wearing glasses. And that's another quick little funny aside. A boy 2 years older than I was asked me out on a date in the beginning of 10th grade when I was still wearing glasses. And we were a double date. And we went back to the house. Mama had put on the stove this Jiffy Pop popcorn. It was in a little thing it was an aluminum thing with a handle, and the popcorn popped up. And she brought it out. And I took it and I put it on the sofa. Well, this boy leaned over and gave me a peck on the lips. I was so shocked, I sat down in the popcorn. I will never forget that. I was mortified. So that's just a cute little aside.
Do you want to mention his name?
No.
Oh, okay.
But it was fun.
Were you active in any of the clubs in high school?
Oh, yes. I was a vice president of Civinettes. I was president of the Future Teachers. I was on the tennis team. I was one of the first 4 girls to letter and qualify for the Bulldog Club. And there's a picture of us in our yearbook, the 4 girls sitting right down in front. The boys never said anything, but you could tell all the athletes were not thrilled to have females in their Bulldog Club, but we were the very first ones.
Who were some of those other girls?
Let's see. There was Connie Fair was number 1, and she ended up being a tennis pro. And then there was Katie Brown and Jenny Hathaway, and Jenny and I was the last one, so I would sometimes be able to challenge Jenny and move into her spot, but most of the time I was at the end.
Do you still correspond with all of these girls?
I see the girls definitely at reunions. I have remained close friends with Connie and Katie. We had Mary Kay Stoudemire, who was 2 years behind us, who became number 1 during our senior year. And also, although she's been long deceased, the first number 1 player was Carolyn Tubbs, who lived down in the 500 block of North Florida.
Is there anything else before I get to the end that you'd like to bring up that I haven't mentioned?
Well, I can't think of anything right off the top of my head other than like repeating myself, that the privilege I had of being the daughter of the parents that I had the luck to withdraw. That I have my son, Clark, whose last name is Van Houten, who is the pride and joy of my life. He is the light of my life.
That brings me to the question, how would you like to be remembered?
I would like to be remembered in posterity for being a good mother.
And where do you think you learned the lessons of being a good mother?
Definitely from my parents, who both had very difficult childhoods. My father grew up in an orphanage. Her mother died when she was 8. It's very important for children to have models. And as an educator, believe me, I truly understand that. My parents did not have models, but they knew what they wanted for me. And they were able to do it without spoiling me. They weren't overly strict, but it was definite that you followed certain rules. They were naturals. And as you once said, they were professional parents. They made a tremendous difference in my whole life, in my ability as a parent, in my ability as a teacher, in my ability on my whole outlook of life. And the only other thing I wanted to mention, I thought of something, is that I have never been bored 1 minute in my entire life. And that is because I learned early on that whatever is inside of you is what you need to develop. And I would love to think, and I would, as I said, make up many imaginary things. And I just never had a moment, even though I was by myself or with somebody else, never bored.
Well, that leads me into one of these last questions. What advice would you give to young people today?
I would tell young people to be guided by your own inner spirit, to do what you want to do, to definitely listen to others and take their advice, but to ultimately be yourself.
Thank you, Mary T. It's been wonderful talking with you and getting to know you even better since first grade.
Thank you, Carmen. Good. Was that all right?